What you're about to see is an overview of the Grade 7 POSOH unit. This is the first of 3 units that are developed with this project, POSOH, that's funded by the U.S. Department of Agriculture and involves a partnership of educators and scientists at UW-Madison, the Great Lakes Bioenergy Research Center, the College of Menominee Nation and their Sustainable Development Institute, and other educators at Michigan State University. These units are being developed through an important process where the process is as important as the products, the units that we're developing. It's part of a bigger project in which we really want to build capacity and understanding about sustainability and bioenergy in the region, as at the same time developing a model for how we could do something like this similarly in other places in the nation. What we're going to show you a brief overview about is the first of the 3 units that we'll be developing. Teaches sustainability and bioenergy concepts in the context of the Menominee Forest. This is a place-based curriculum that incorporates sociocultural and science concepts that are relevant for 7th grade students together in a very compelling way. The way that we develop this unit is unique. We bring together a team of community members, educators who come from schools and educators who are part of the community, along with scientists. About 20 people were involved in the design of this particular unit. And once they've spent time together, decided what the learning goals should be, and mapped out a learning journey for the unit, a team of curriculum developers at UW and also CMN and Michigan State University worked together through an iterative process where we continued to receive input from our design team to develop the unit that you'll see here. The path that students take we call a conceptual activity flow. So we refer to the different chunks of concepts that students learn as CAFs or CAFs. You'll see that in the overview. And what we'd like to present now is a brief description of each of the lessons within the conceptual activity flow so that you get a sense of the learning journey that students take in the Grade 7 POSOH unit.
One of the key things that we wanted for the POSOH Grade 7 unit from the leadership team and the design team conversations that we had and the community meetings that we had was that we wanted students to learn science and culture as intertwined ideas that both related to their lives and provided grounding in their lives. So for the Grade 7 unit, the central question that came up was how is the Menominee Forest unique? This came about when we talked to a group of students during the design team, and we realized that the students were very connected to their place and very connected to the Menominee Forest. But because they were so connected to it, they didn't necessarily have a sense of why their place was unique and how their place was different from neighboring areas as well as other forests. So the guiding question for our Grade 7 unit is what makes the Menominee Forest unique? The themes that emerged from the design team meetings that we felt that the Grade 7 unit should really address were students' understandings of ecological interactions, biodiversity, and sustainability. These 3 themes form the foundations of the science content that we wanted students to learn. In addition, though, because this is a place-based, culturally relevant unit, we wanted the unit to be completely integrated and founded on Menominee cultural values as well, and not necessarily as separate from the science content, but we wanted students to be able to see the connections between the cultural values and how the Menominee lived in their place. Additionally, one of the things in terms of scientific inquiry as well as cultural ways of learning is that we wanted students to be learning about different ways of knowing? What are the different ways that people learn about the natural world and make sense of the world around them? We begin with this idea of story. So our first lesson consists of a story construction activity in which students get picture cards taken from a story, and in groups they're asked to assemble them in the order that they think the story happened. And through this process, students are asked to reflect on what they noticed in the cards and what evidence they were using to decide which cards came first and what was the end of the story and what were the events of the story. Through this activity, teachers will guide students through thinking about the process they use to construct their story as kind of a metaphor for science, for the work that scientists do in terms of explaining the natural world as a story and pulling from evidence and creating models that help them explain how things happened. Through this activity, students are able to see that different groups attended to different evidence and different groups came up with different stories. And so they were able to learn that there are multiple perspectives and there are different perspectives, and even given the same data, the same base stuff, that students attended to different evidences to make exceedingly different stories. To give students a concrete way to visualize how they were going to be learning, and that they would, by the end of the unit, be constructing their own stories using evidence from their learning throughout. The next introductory lesson involves setting up student science notebooks, but what we're doing is calling them inquiry logs. And in these inquiry logs, students are keeping track of their science learning as well as reflecting on their learning in two different parts of the notebook. So there's a learning log about the science aspects of the unit, and then in the reflection log side, students are asked to connect what they're learning to their personal experiences and what they know about their communities. And oftentimes the reflection log is also asking them to connect their learning to their cultures. We saw the reflection log as a really important place for students to connect to science, for students to connect to science, to connect to culture, and to do that work of thinking about, okay, why is this relevant to who I am? It's important to mention that the intent is not to divide science and culture by having two parts to the inquiry log. For the third lesson in the unit, this is where teachers lead students through a sharing and a reading of stories about their place. And this is where the guiding question for the unit actually comes out. Also, taking a step back from their personal stories, students will look at satellite images of Wisconsin, and then central northern Wisconsin, and then specifically Menominee County. And they're asked to make observations and notice the patterns that they see as they're looking at these images. And through these experiences of experiencing the forest from different perspectives, the students and the teacher basically define the guiding question for the unit as, how is the Menominee Forest unique? Throughout the unit then, students will be working to develop an answer to that question. We incorporated an inquiry chart into the unit where teachers create a class chart where students can keep track of what they've learned about the forest, how they've learned it, and what do they need to know next to answer the guiding question. So once students in the unit have posed the question of how is the Menominee Forest unique, one of the first things that need to happen as a place-based and a culturally relevant way of knowing is to go into the forest. And so the second kind of part of the unit takes students into the forest, where they are initially asked to just notice what they see, what they smell, what they hear, you know, any affect they have while being in the forest. And then through reading another story written by Dr. Geraldine Greeno from CMN on her experiences of noticing in the forest, students are guided to notice a little bit more carefully. You know, they're asked to stand in a place in the forest and to look up and look down and look around and notice how the forest is organized and what they see in the forest when they look a little bit more closely. So once students have been in the forest and have carefully noticed in the forest, we want to have students think about understanding their place in a different way, you know, using a different way of knowing. So going into the next lesson, we pose to students the question of how would you describe the Menominee Forest and its layout to somebody who has never visited. So in this way, we're asking students to bring in their prior experiences, their prior knowledge. So we want to engage and value the knowledge that they're bringing in from their outside of school lives. Students look at different photographs of the forest and first consider the vertical organization of the Menominee Forest. And using picture cards, they're asked to put the pictures in order as they would if they were looking up, and then continue to look down onto the forest floor. And so through this, students get an understanding that, you know, there's different layers in the forest. You know, there's a canopy and a subcanopy and herbaceous plants. The next series of data that students look at, they look at different maps of Wisconsin. Through analyzing the data and trying to look for the patterns in these maps, students begin to understand how there's differences in the horizontal landscape, not only across Wisconsin, but even on the Menominee Reservation. And they notice that some soil types are commonly found on the Menominee Reservation while others are not. And we have them begin to reflect on what that means for the kinds of things that, living things that would be found in the forest and where, and students can start hypothesizing about where things might be found. One of the main points of this lesson is to help students understand that there are vertically and horizontally a huge variety of microhabitats that exist, and that these may support different living things that have different types of needs. Students are asked to begin their forest models where they draw their understanding of the forest as a way to represent their learning. And then they will revise this, they'll revise this over time as their understanding of the forest becomes more and more complex. In addition, teachers will set up what we've called an environmental conditions axis in the classroom that students can constantly refer back to over time as they learn more and more about the forest. And this initial axis will show differences in the vertical organization in terms of light quantity that that filters down to the forest floor. And on the horizontal axis, they'll have different water quality, like soil quality in general, you know, going from really dry land, dry soil, through wetland, and then an aquatic habitat. Once students start developing an understanding of the variety of microhabitats that exist, we tie this particular part of the unit in with the next part of the unit, by having students develop investigations involving different microhabitats. Also to bring in our ways of knowing theme, students are able to set up investigations of their own where they explore how they model the forest in bottles, and they explore how different microhabitats are related to the needs of the things that might be growing in them. So students might decide to investigate the needs of plants growing in the same plant and how its growth is affected by growing in nutrient-poor soil versus nutrient-rich soil. And they set up these bottles and run their investigations through the next few weeks of the unit, and we'll come back to that later. As students then pursue their question of what things are found in the forest and what can we learn about those, what can we learn about the forest from those things, we've introduced this section of the unit with an Indigenous story called Gluskabe and the Four Wishes, which is a Abenaki story where a hunter, after showing respect to Gluskabe, asks to learn how to hunt better so he can support his people and his family through hunting. He notices when his wish is fulfilled that he can hear the voices of the animals and the things in the forest that are telling him about their ways and how they live and their behaviors. By including this story, we've made a very intentional decision to include, it follows with our theme of story and learning from story, and so we've included this at the beginning of the next section because we want students to be able to know that they can learn from Indigenous stories and that they can learn about nature and they can learn about learning science through these stories. Something that came up in the design team was that elders in the community and community members were concerned that students didn't see the value in learning from their own stories and their community stories. So we wanted very explicitly to have a learning goal be that students begin to value and understand that there is knowledge inscribed in these stories and that this knowledge is valuable and important, not just in a cultural sense, but actually in a learning about nature sense. We're also trying to help build those bridges from the school to the community and have students follow up on and extend their own learning that happens in the classroom into the community and see that as a two-way street and two-way experience rather than, you know, the important learning happens in school. So once students have interpreted and discussed the lesson of the Gluskabe story, they move into the next lesson in this section where they actually will write perspective-taking stories about various organisms that are found in the Menominee forest. And these organisms have been carefully chosen by us in terms of what's found in the Menominee forest, what is relevant to Menominee, either culturally or spiritually, economically. and what organisms display ecological interactions that will come up later in the unit. So these are chosen by us, but the students get to choose from that list what they would like to write a perspective-taking story. An element of the perspective-taking story, one of the reasons why the perspective-taking story was a very important part of this unit, again, as mentioned in the story puzzle part, is that a strong Menominee cultural value that came up in the design team is that the Menominee value learning by taking multiple perspectives, and they value as a way of knowing and as a way of learning about each other as well as the natural world. Being able to take multiple perspectives and the perspectives of other things that we're related to and come into contact with. As a means to further support students in learning from school as well as community resources, we've incorporated into the perspective-taking story lessons ways that students can research from written text as well as oral histories and verbal knowledge, from the community. In order to support students in learning how to learn from the community, we've developed a video. Once the students are given a chance to put their perspective-taking stories together, the next lesson involves students sharing their stories with their classmates. So for example, you might have a student who wrote a story from the perspective of a sturgeon, and another student might have written their story from the perspective of a maple tree, and so on. So we want students to be able to share their stories with each other so as to begin to see patterns in terms of the needs that these organisms have for survival and the different ways in which the organisms meet their needs.
Yeah, I remember working with a young man named Shane in the Oneida Turtle School, and he chose to be the sturgeon, and he had heard a little bit about sturgeon from probably his parents or cousins from fishing. But then when I spoke to him about creating his story and going over the expectations of what you need to include in the story, he started asking me all the questions. Oh, well, how long can I live? And how many eggs can I lay? And how big can I get? And I really just used our story as a way for him to initiate his own learning with taking on the perspective of the thing. And he was instantly motivated from the start to do more research on the sturgeon, and he became fascinated with the idea that the sturgeon's an ancient fish, akin to a dinosaur, and that he seemed proud that he was the only one in the group that had that thing.
Once students have brainstormed the different types of relationships that exist amongst the organisms that they wrote their perspective-taking stories about, they move into the next section of the unit, which is really grounded in the Menominee concept of Natanawe Makanak. where everything is considered to be connected and related, and everything in the natural world is considered to have its own role and place. So the sequence of the Natanewe Makanak series of lessons begins with a story, of course, that students are asked to read and interpret to get an initial understanding and to share their initial thoughts about this idea of everything being connected and everything being related. Following this story, students physically construct a relationship web based on the organisms that they wrote their perspective-taking stories about and the relationships that were brainstormed. Through this process of physically constructing the web, once again, students are asked to take the perspective of another thing in the forest, as well as themselves as being human beings who live in the forest, and physically see all the variety of connections that exist amongst the things that are in the forest. They're also asked in response to certain scenarios to shake the web when changes happen in the forest. And through this physical acting out, students get a sense of, even though everything is not directly connected, that a change in one area can cause changes throughout the connections in the forest. The next level of understanding the relationships in the forest moves to understanding ecological interactions in the forest. So these relationships might kind of loosely be construed, but then students are asked to consider how competition impacts populations in the forest and the relationships that exist, or how mutualism or commensalism influence changes in the population based on organisms meeting their needs for survival. The next layer of everything being connected is understanding that things are connected over time. So students get some practice at interpreting and analyzing population graphs and predicting what might have happened to have led to those population changes, and bringing in their own prior knowledge as well as their understanding of ecological interactions to suggest hypotheses for why populations might have changed in certain ways over time based on how they're connected to each other, to their habitats, as well as to human beings. Another important component of Natanewe Makanak is the idea that in the natural order, everything has its role. So we have incorporated the idea of ecological roles of organisms into the relationship web portion of the unit, so that students can start considering and building academic language about carnivores, omnivores, and the various ways that we characterize the roles that organisms play in the forest relationship web. Throughout this set of lessons, students are asked to reflect on their learning about Natanewe Makanak as they consider the various dimensions of the relationships that exist in the forest. As a culminating part of the relationship web section of the unit, students are asked to revisit their habitat column investigations and interpret the data to construct explanations for what they noticed in their habitat columns by using evidence and their understandings about variation in microhabitats, the availability of resources in those habitats, as well as the needs of things or organisms in the forest and the relationships that exist amongst organisms and their habitats. So using all the understanding from the previous parts of the unit, students construct explanations for their results. Up till this point in the unit, students will have learned about forest ecology in the context of the Menominee Forest. However, they will notice that they don't have enough knowledge about the forest to completely answer how is the Menominee Forest unique. In order to guide them more specifically about what's going on in the Menominee Forest and what has gone on in the Menominee Forest, students will engage in 2 case studies to apply their learning up to this point, as well as to learn how to construct explanations based on evidence and data to understand how relationships change in the Menominee Forest with the introduction of a new organism, as well as learn about how management practices in the Menominee Forest have supported values leading to sustainable practices and the maintenance of ecological interactions and biodiversity that are supported by Menominee cultural values. We bring the story back to the students. Just as they had constructed stories in the very first lesson based on the story cards, now students get a chance to create their stories of the forest based on their understandings created from the unit. So in this lesson, students reflect back on their learning and think about what they've learned about the horizontal and vertical landscapes and what they've learned about the organisms that live in the forest and what they've learned about the ecological interactions that happen and how the Menominee take care of the forest and the forest takes care of the Menominee. Through the case studies, students interweave all of these perspectives together to create their own story and to think about what their role is in the forest and what role they want to take on in the forest as a culminating project. In this, students can either write stories or construct art projects or construct their own videos to tell their story about their learning and basically answer that guiding question of how they think the Menominee Forest is unique. And because one of our goals is to help students understand that there are multiple ways of learning and knowing about the natural world, they'll write about kind of how they've come to those understandings, how they've learned about the forest biodiversity or that the forest is biodiverse and that this is a unique characteristic of the Menominee Forest. Through this lesson, based on Menominee cultural values of youth and individuals taking on their own specified roles in the community based on what's meaningful to them, we wanted to build in a lesson where students learn how to take action and students learn how to become parts of their community as they go into the future and think about the sustainability of the Menominee Forest, the survival of the Menominee Forest, as well as Menominee culture. So students can engage in either individual projects or group projects or class-based projects where they get to see what they can do for the community and what power they have to help their communities.
Well, it's a very good place-based forestry unit, and I really like the idea that the place-based aspect of it keeps it grounded somewhere. And I live 25 miles from the Menominee Reservation. I live 25 miles from Kashina. I'm immersed in this culture, but yet I don't know much about this culture. And as a teacher, I've had a few Native American students come through my classroom, but I didn't know what to do as far as understanding what their values were, where they came from, what they believed in. In this unit itself, there's so many different lessons in there that not only tie scientific inquiry to Native American culture, but it brings it alive in a new way. So as a teacher from a neighboring school district, it would have been, for me, a powerful tool to really reach students.
I think this unit is a great way to excite students' long-term involvement in science itself. I think that science has turned off kids in the past when it was disconnected from their lives and their experiences. And this unit uses all of that and incorporates the whole child into the picture rather than just teaching them a static set of rules in a book or one right answers to certain questions. This unit really takes the kids' own questions into account and uses it to build their own story, their own understanding of the scientific principles involved with sustainability of the Menominee Forest. I think that if I was learning this unit as a 7th grader, I think I'd want to stay in the same class for a couple of years and maybe explore a career related to science.